Okay, I think we can get started. Thank you all for joining us today. And as a reminder, the DAO meeting is for the DAO. So at any point, just feel free to unmute yourself and we can discuss any topic or any conversation. You can unmute yourself and join the conversation, or type it at the bar in your chat, and we will discuss it or relate to the rest of the audience. Okay, we can maybe start with updates from Beanstalk Farms, and today maybe we'll get started with development. How's it going, Silo Chad?
Hey, Mod. It's going pretty good. A lot of activity the last week. So a couple big things. So first and foremost, the Wells code is now in team review. So we're performing our sort of sequence of code reviews and making some updates to documentation and a number of other things on that front, but looking to get that in front of top-born auditors as quickly as possible. The scope of that code as it stands, Publius can speak more to later if he'd like to, but covers the core well functionality and the constant product pricing function. So what remains to be done is an implementation of a pump, which for everyone's, as a reminder, is effectively an oracle, and then the integration of Beanstalk into wells using data from the pumps. So the structure is there, the pump itself needs to be implemented, but that's all on the horizon. So we'll be focused pretty hard on that this week. Aside from that, over the last couple of weeks, we made some refactors to the Beanstalk repository, which for those of you that have been following the code, you've probably noticed, and a lot of movement on related pieces there. So I just go scan through the commits on the Beanstalk repo if you want to get a sense for what's going on. But we're shipping code across the UI, the SDK, and a couple other components as well to just kind of keep the ball moving. On the UI front right now, Beansama is working hard on adding functionality to support claiming and doing an arbitrary action on the website. So you'll be able to, for example, claim your earned beans or plant your earned beans before depositing or something similar to that. So yeah, I think those are the big things. Lots of other discussions happening about future work, and there's some discussions about future silo upgrades happening. Breen is working on wrapping up the zero withdrawal timer update, which will go to Halborn again for a review sometime soon. But beyond that, just continuing to make progress where we can.
Thank you, Chad. And Sweet Red Beans, did you want to continue from there?
Yeah, sounds good. So yeah, the UI for Claim and Do X is being worked on. And then on our end, we're sort of finishing up additional capability there. So the ability to add plant to any transaction, that should be finished by the end of the week. And then this week has been mostly working on documentation for Pod Marketplace V2 design decisions. So just sort of, this is going to be helpful when we sort of get to implementation. It's also sort of helping me find the necessary gaps. And so have spent a bunch of time sort of enhancing the coloring system that we're going to be using for inspecting market depth of the Pod Marketplace, and excited for some of the changes there. And then hoping to, in the next week or so, sort of begin UI work required for some of the new stuff that's going to be finished, specifically the withdrawal timer going to 0, and then the Dutch auction for the field. And so that's sort of what's on my list at the moment.
Thank you, Sweet Red. Okay, let's maybe move to a little bit of marketing. Farmer Dan, how are you doing?
Hey, Matt, I'm doing well. Yeah, not too much substantive to report on right now. Guy and Chad and I actually have a meeting after this. We're going to kind of map out things from like a month perspective, like quarterly and like kind of some yearly goals as well. I know one thing that I want to start highlighting more is all of the technical advancements that have happened, as well as, those 2 papers that the Publius put out recently. Those are awesome. I'd love to break those down and share them as well.
And I believe Triton is also working on a video.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Triton put together a script and has been editing a video. I mean, a lot of the stuff that he's been doing is great. Like any of the like logo updates that you see, like the Beanstalk Farms Twitter logo, as well as like just like refreshing everything. It's been super great to have. So yeah, that as well.
Very good. Thank you, Farmer Dan. KXO, who's one of the audience with us today, is a full stack engineer and has reached out. I've asked him to reach out to you, Sarah, Chad. So this is, I believe they will. So this is just an FYI.
Sweet, great to meet you.
All right, how's it going, Guy?
Hey Mod, doing well, and GM everybody. Just wanted to talk briefly about, some of the budget conversations that were had over the last week. Obviously, BIP 31, the budget BIP for Q1, and the Seraph BIP and BIP 32 ended over the weekend and didn't pass. And I feel like it should be said, at least from the budget perspective, that it was pretty disappointing to see, not just in terms of voter turnout, but particularly in the amount of discussion, particularly in regards to the Seraph BIP, which I think still hasn't gotten a whole lot of attention or discussion at the moment. And feel like this concept of discussion being critical to Beanstalk governance is really not just a trope. And I feel like on Monday, that was made abundantly clear to all of us with the activity in the chat and folks hopping on impromptu voice calls. And it's really difficult to, get a sense for what the community is thinking and getting feedback without discussion, asking questions, things like that. All that said, still feel like the amounts proposed in the budget were extremely reasonable, and think there's a surprising number of people that are fixated on things that aren't heavily spent on, like the songs and the seasonal themes on the UI, and perhaps that disconnect to some extent is just what happens to get announced in Discord, given that so much of the development work is in progress, and not sure how much sense it makes to announce development updates in progress, like in the announcements channel, for example. However, we are in every DAO meeting talking about those very things in progress, and also feel like a lot of the output in terms of what beans are actually spent on, is pretty adequately covered in the BIP as well as the operations reports, and haven't heard too much feedback on those being sparse in that light. So, with regards to all that feedback, I think it was interesting to see some of the community expressing interest in voting on budgets less often, something like a 6-month budget. I think that's certainly something to consider given the context of, not sure it's a really desirable state for Beanstalk Farms to, no longer be funded within a month's time in the event that a budget BIP doesn't pass, given that even if a budget BIP doesn't pass, there should probably be some opportunity to iterate a couple times on it and repropose to the DAO. So all that said, with regards to the Seraph BIP and the lack of discussion, perhaps it makes sense to have Halborn attend one of these DAO meetings again to discuss and demo what they would actually be doing on their end to help protect Beanstalk. And finally, I guess with regards to timing and reproposal, so Chad mentioned the remove withdraw timer BIP that Breen has been very heavily responsible for. Hopefully we can get the final audit reports for that, as well as the Sunrise Improvements BIP, which introduces the Dutch auction in the field and adjust the Sunrise base incentive reward. And given that we do have Beanstalk Farms does have the funding for another month or so, I think there is some value in having some of these BIPs go up at the same time so farmers can vote on them simultaneously. So, hopefully the four proposals being the budget, Seraph, the remove withdraw timer, and the Sunrise improvements, hopefully those can go out sometime in the next 2 or 3 weeks. But I think it's also important to have the Sunrise BIP and remove withdraw timer BIP up on Immunify for some amount of time, call it a couple weeks. So that was a lot, but hope that provides some color on some of the thinking around the budget and reproposing some point in the near future.
And Guy, maybe this is something that has been briefly discussed, or maybe not discussed, is the duration of the vote. Is this something that can be considered? And if it is to be considered, does that need a BIP for it to be also changed?
Well, it can certainly be considered. I haven't personally put any thought into it, although that's interesting. Yeah, I don't know if I have any really thoughts offhand on it. But with regards to your last question, it would certainly require a BIP in order to change.
Okay, and as we stand right now, as you said, is that Beanstalk Farms more or less still has a budget for another month, and then and during this time where we expect to repropose the budget BIP.
That's right, and obviously happy to use this time to answer any questions about any of that. That's exactly what these meetings are for. So, would love to, start some discussion, both in the chat as well as live, if folks are interested.
Okay, and the thinking is maybe instead of proposing a quarterly budget, it'll be a half, or a budget for the half, basically.
Yeah, unclear at the moment. As I was mentioning, fortunately, it's not time critical on a day-to-day basis. We do have a month or at least a couple weeks to think this through. Perhaps one solution, even if the concept is to have 6-month budgets, is to separate those two budgets into different BIPs, but just propose them at the same time. That would be one option as well. It could also be what you just suggested, which was proposing a budget for all of Q1 and Q2. Not totally clear what the right answer is.
But I guess we, as the saying goes, we're all trying to figure it out. So we'll see how the discussion goes. Okay. Publius, I guess maybe there are two things to discuss here. The technical bit, which Sarah Chad maybe touched upon a bit when it comes to wells, and then the second bit is the budget and your thoughts, on the overall, DAO and the development of Beanstalk. Any thoughts there that you'd like to share with the community?
So defer to Publius on the the technical updates. But do want to comment on the governance front without even getting into the substance of the budget BIP and the Seraph BIP. It does feel like the friction to change the protocol is getting higher and higher over time. Now, on the one hand, that is by design. And the goal is at the protocol layer for things to ossify over time. And that is one of the core features of money that is necessary. If the money can change constantly, it's probably not a good store of value. And therefore, it's hard to know what the solution is in terms of maintaining high levels of difficulty in changing the protocol or changing a version of the protocol, and ensuring that there continues to be a free ability to iterate and innovate on the protocol. And those two things are almost directly at odds. And so the punchline is perhaps that the governance system that is currently in place is good at some things and bad at other things. And if you consider how smart contract or DAO-based governance is very similar in some ways, but also very different from L1 governance, where the ability to fork a layer one is much more explicitly defined within the nature of the protocol. It probably makes sense to take another look at the governance process overall and figure out where a better balance can be struck between difficulty in changing the protocol that people have exposure to while not limiting development or innovation. And in particular, don't really feel like a budget BIP falls into this territory as much as the Seraph BIP does. From a substantive perspective, do feel like that BIP was very thoughtful and relevant given what has happened to Beanstalk in the past, and do think that it's a bad sign that that BIP didn't come close to a quorum. And that seems to be, I mean, it is worth saying, Beanstalk has basically never been good enough to exist in perpetuity, and it appears it still isn't. But the market has a really beautiful way of finding the weak points and the least common denominators and the high friction points within the system that are preventing it from maintaining peg or decreasing the debt level or a variety of different things. And while from an economics perspective, it feels like the main least common denominators at the moment are the seeds per BDV and the temperature reflexivity on the downside. That's lacking. At least from our perspective, it really does feel like the governance at the moment is the least common denominator. And on the one hand, governance is at this point perhaps, I don't know if scary is the right word, but it might be, given what's happened to Beanstalk in the past. But it does feel like the time is now to start to really think about what a long-term system of governance looks like, and independent of how quickly it's all migrated back on chain or not. From a very high level, there does seem to need to be some changes in the way that the protocol is governed, in addition to where it's governed, on or off chain. So that is going to be something that we intend to spend a lot of time thinking about over the next couple of weeks, and that probably is where at the margin the most improvements to Beanstalk can be made in the short term, such that it's more likely at the margin to exist in perpetuity or be able to exist in perpetuity. So on the one hand, good problems to have. The market showing where Beanstalk is weak is never a bad thing, unless it destroys the protocol like what happened in April. So that type of catastrophe aside, hard to think of the fact that 2 bips didn't pass as an existential crisis as much as just an indication that there are still major problems with the protocol that really do need to be improved on and iterated on. So governance is quickly being pointed to, or strongly being pointed to, as something that requires some iteration at the protocol level at the moment, and we look forward to participating in that process over the next couple weeks and months. But it's hard to, at the same time, it is worth saying that it's hard to feel good about, as Guy was saying, the quality and amount of discussion on the bips prior to them failing. If you look at the history of Beanstalk, it really does feel like discussion has even decreased. And so we would just, I mean, to some extent, we also have not been participating as much as we used to. And so perhaps we can do a better job as well of participating in these discussions. But as has always been the case, we really don't want Publius to be a necessary voice in the process, and perhaps the system's just not there yet where we can really not participate in these governance discussions at all. And that's, I guess, neither here nor there, although if it, in a perfect world, it certainly would be unnecessary for us to participate. So with all that being said, very much excited to work on the governance with other members of the DAO and participate in hopefully a constructive discussion on what's important from a decentralized governance perspective. But it's probably not something that a clear answer is going to present itself in the next day. And it's more likely to be something that will take weeks or even months to fix, and or even fix enough such that the protocol can continue to iterate while maintaining its integrity. And that is a very complex, nuanced position to try to maintain, but it's one that's going to be necessary for the protocol to do. So a little bit of a ramble here, but feel like this is the issue of the day at the moment, and therefore worthy of discussion.
Thank you, Publius. And I know we maybe also ask for some technical updates, but maybe we'll give it a few minutes and pause here and see if any of the DAO members or the community have thoughts that they would like to share. I see Discourse2 is typing, so we can wait for that message. Discourse2 says that participation seems tied to protocol performance. I think there might be some truth to that, in the sense it doesn't have to be with the protocol performance in general. Maybe it's overall performance, of everything on the market. What I find or think is interesting is that, to an extent, the two BIPs are different. They are they could be related to an extent, but they were separate BIPs. But the one thing common between them is the lack or the low turnout amongst them. So maybe it's less about the content of the BIPs themselves and more of the overall market, I would say, and part of it is the protocol performance, of course.
Yeah, and would add that, if anything, given that Beanstalk is supposed to be able to exist in all market conditions, that perhaps that is the thing that the system needs to improve upon, is how to have a consistent governance system independent of external market conditions.
Do you think, Publius, the protocol, though cannot exist, I mean, as you said, exist in all market conditions, will it not exist if the BIPs don't pass? I think, is it more of, what we're talking about here is the development of it, and this is the time to develop, and pausing development is unwise. So it's not really about it's not an existential risk for the protocol, but it's more of a lost opportunity to continue developing, in this time.
It's unclear. On the one hand, there's no reason to shut Beanstalk down in the sense that it can run forever on Ethereum. But on the other hand, if for example, the DAO is unwilling to approve changes to the system in any capacity, like the seeds per BDV per deposit, such that the economic model can continue to be improved or the governance system can continue to be improved, even if things aren't shut down at the protocol level, it does seem unlikely that Beanstalk will be the issuer of the new money. And to your point, Mod, at the margin, the bear market really is a fabulous time to build the stuff that is necessary, such that when external circumstances do change, the protocol and the ecosystem at large is ready for capital. And this was one of the things that we were hoping to allude to in the pieces that we wrote, which is that currently the DeFi tech stack, given that censorship resistance is a least common denominator problem, the current DeFi tech stack is unable to support any real economic activity. And so even if the market changes at some point and the protocol starts to grow again, without the full tech stack to support permissionless or trustless use of beans for real economic activity, it's unlikely that the system will be sustainable in perpetuity from an economics perspective. And so something we've talked about extensively is the difference between speculative demand and utility-based demand. And while when the market conditions change, it's not impossible that there ends up coming to be demand for beans that is speculative. At the moment, we can say confidently that there still is really no utility-based demand for beans. And you could make an argument that the paradox pools and the root partnership, that was the first instance of utility-based demand for beans, but it wasn't trustless in the sense that every part of the stack was not censorship resistant. And there is a lot of work to be done to get to a point where beans can be used for real trustless economic activity. So do feel like it is a big, if there's no development happening and there's no changes to the protocol happening until the market turns, that would be at the margin a major loss for the protocol. And I do think it is worth zooming out and putting Beanstalk in the larger context, which is this is all open source tech. And there's nothing preventing anyone from forking Beanstalk and starting it over. And the main reason that Beanstalk continues to exist in its current capacity and not any other capacity, if we had to guess, was that there is a real network effect that exists from the fact that there are thousands of stockholders and thousands of pod holders and many fertilizer holders. And from that perspective, the real cost will likely not be that Beanstalk dies, but that this version of Beanstalk is outcompeted by another version of Beanstalk. And it is important to acknowledge that in an open source environment, this really is a survival of the fittest type of situation. And if the DAO is unable or unwilling to iterate on the protocol such that it continues to be the best iteration of Beanstalk, or at least the best iteration of Beanstalk when considering the network effect. So even if it's not the perfect implementation, there's a slightly better one. When you consider the network effect, it's likely that Beanstalk could still have staying power. It really is important to acknowledge that if Beanstalk just stops being changed in its current form, it's highly unlikely to succeed, and it's highly likely to be forked and replaced by another network that is able to iterate. And again, if we go back to where we started talking about this, there really is something to be said for the ability for the protocol to ossify and making changes to the protocol to be more difficult. And this is one of those two things can be true at once. And so the exact solution where Beanstalk can remain competitive and continue to iterate while there are some guarantees to people that if they don't want changes to the protocol to be made, that they don't necessarily need to maintain exposure to those changes, that can happen. And so, I mean, if we consider how forking an L1 really changes, is different from forking Beanstalk, for example, the primary difference is that the assets that give Beanstalk their value are generally unforkable or largely unforkable. So the liquidity in the liquidity pools cannot be duplicated in the same way that if you fork Bitcoin, you can reissue all the Bitcoin to the same owners as of a block number, or just fork the protocol effectively. That doesn't hold in this environment because of the nature of how beans get their value, and it creates a very tough set of problems that the governance system ultimately needs to answer. And again, it does feel like at the margin, this is now the biggest risk to Beanstalk is an inability to govern itself. So perhaps this is a little bit of a rambling here, but a lot of different contradictory thoughts that are going to have to be integrated in order to create a fully functioning, sustainable governance system.
Yeah, and I think there is some irony in being if the better version of Beanstalk is not one that is has better tech but has better governance. And of course you can argue that governance is part of the tech, but maybe a version of Beanstalk that is able to make better governance decisions, let's say, is the one that will outcompete the current version. Okay, I see some more typing at the Barnyard chat, so let's wait and see some thoughts. Okay, going to read Warthog's post or message. So the Publius blogs were great to communicate the roadmap. They were posted with about a day left to vote coming out of the holidays. Before those blogs, it has mostly been when wells, with a vague understanding of what the team is actually building. Also, I think bear market and the timing hurt the vote. Recent information about the irrigation protocol is also exciting. Need to scream from the hills about the roadmap and potential enhancements to get the votes in. Average bean holders don't have time or take effort to dig through different chat rooms on Discord to figure out the news. Mixolydian says, given that Beanstalk is trying to compete in terms of cost of centralized financial primitives, do you think being on Ethereum, where the gas costs are prohibitive, means that it's basically impossible to reach this goal of being frictionless? Publius, do you wanna answer Mixolydian's maybe thought, and we go back to Warthog?
Sure. I mean, from our perspective, the goal is to create a censorship-resistant money, and Ethereum is by far the most censorship-resistant network that can support Beanstalk and the associated technology. One thing that seems almost certain is that if that changes, that the protocol will be able to migrate to wherever it is best. And similar to how Beanstalk is in a competition with other versions of Beanstalk, Ethereum is in competition with other versions of Ethereum. That might be a little bit too much of a stretch, but the concept is, from an L1 perspective, don't feel that Beanstalk is tied to Ethereum. At the moment, it probably is tied to the EVM. But in terms of long term, the assumption has to be that gas costs on the Ethereum network will trend towards zero without, obviously, they can never reach the limit. But through scaling technology, you'd expect those costs to approach the zero limit. And independent of that, the question is really, where is the most censorship resistant network? And feel like it's not a competition at this point. So if that changes, that'll be another conversation for the DAO to have, but not a priority at the moment from our perspective.
Okay, and going back to Warthog's message, it is interesting, and maybe part of it where we discussed earlier is if the vote period was longer, maybe there is some thought to put in that budget BIPs will have a longer voting period than maybe other BIPs. But it's also difficult to or try to do it with every time there is a BIP to be proposed. There needs to be some accompanying blog post, even though there is a good write-up with every BIP, but something else that spurs, let's say, encouragement.
I mean, just speaking in my own opinion, I think that would be a dramatic waste of time. I think that there's very limited resources in the Beanstalk ecosystem at the moment, and the idea that now things need to be written more than once, we need better solutions than that.
Yeah, a part of it may be that also no changes happen and that farmers just get more active in the sense that they talk to other farmers and encourage them to vote. But we will find out, I guess, very soon when the BIP is reproposed. Discus 2 says, if governance depends on participation and participation wanes as attention drifts to other projects, then Beanstalk needs to do more to attract that attention back. Give people a reason to feel excited. Price is part of that. Tokenomics is part of that. BizDev activity is probably the biggest attention attractor. Safe governance through vigorous biz development. Discus 2, do you maybe want to elaborate a bit on what is the business development that you're talking or thinking about, and maybe tokenomics or the other things that you mentioned?
Yeah, I would second that, which is to say that it continues to be unclear what business development looks like for a protocol like Beanstalk. And furthermore, the concept that attention has drifted towards other projects. Not sure what projects are even out there that are receiving much attention. So it at least seems like there's a lot of dead energy in the space, and it's hard to imagine that any amount of shouting from the rooftops, which again we will never do, but even if the DAO wants to fund someone to go shout from the rooftops about this, it doesn't really feel like there's an audience at the moment, which really furthers the point that it probably makes sense to spend this time building the stuff such that whenever people do start to look around again, there's a there, which currently there's probably not.
And I shared a tweet that Farmer Dan shared earlier, showing the activity in December, where basically there is no activity happening at the moment. I think another part of it may also be that this may be the first time a BIP or a considerable BIP is not passed or did not pass, and the thinking might have been amongst farmers is that, hey, it's okay, I don't need to vote because someone else is going to taking it for granted basically. But that goes back again to this is governance at the end of the day. So it is part of the design and worth thinking or looking into. Jay does ask, is there a timeline for native bean launch on Arbitrum or Optimism?
Not at the moment, but I think that Root already exists on Arbitrum. That could be wrong, but I think that's the case.
Yes, I believe Root is on Arbitrum.
So there already is bean exposure on Arbitrum. Not sure when exactly there will be a version of Beanstalk deployed on Arbitrum, but there's certainly a way to get and use beans on Arbitrum. Yeah, I mean, really just to respond to Disco Stew's comment about Frax and Polygon, I mean, Frax is doing lots of stuff. They're doing lots of stuff, but it's almost like, and frankly, haven't been following their project too much in particular, but it seems like all the stuff that they're doing is not interesting at all. And so instead of developing new tech that will be used in perpetuity, they are just figuring out how to drum up interest for Frax, and that seems to be a much more short-term orientation than we think it makes sense to have for Beanstalk. Polygon does have sort of like a well-known, very high output biz dev aspect to it, but would posit that at the end of the day, the real thing that matters is not the business development, it's the tech. And they can in the short term get activity on Polygon at the margin and highlight the activity and make it seem like there's a lot happening. But at the end of the day, the best tech is what's going to end up being used. The whole space is still 15 years old. This is the very early days. And the idea that the thing to optimize around is telling people how great the product is, as opposed to creating a great product, seems totally off base, at least from our perspective. So putting aside the fact that we as Publius really never want to be in the position to be selling Beanstalk or beans, just think that this is not the right way to allocate time, energy, effort, resources, any of the above, because at the end of the day, the only thing that really matters is the best tech. And we would just take this opportunity to really say thank you to Beanstalk Farms, because in our opinion, the work that Beanstalk Farms has been doing, it's almost, when you consider how new Beanstalk Farms is, in the grand scheme of things, it's amazing the amount of iteration and innovation that is coming out of that group of people. And it really does feel tragic to hear people talking in the Discord about the songs that are getting made being a detractor from what's going on. It's like, this is missing the point entirely. And if people are looking substantively at where money is being spent and where time is being spent, I mean, separate from the fact that the culture is a big part of this, and I think the songs are a great part of the culture, the idea that the development that is happening is not good enough is ridiculous. The amount of development that's happening out of Beanstalk Farms is amazing, and would even go so far as to say it feels like the tone of discussion around funding developments really misses the point, which is that the DAO has governance over, I don't know what the total is, but it's more than $10 million of non-Bean assets in the liquidity pools. And if you look at the current run rate and the effect of another year's worth or 2 years worth of run from Beanstalk Farms on the liquidity and the effect it would have on the price, it's like people need to zoom out. Beans have been at 24 cents. Beans have been at 80 cents. The idea that this short-term deviation down to 94 cents where it is now, or going further to 90 cents or 85 cents, that's even a problem, or if it's not a problem at the margin because it could be avoided by not minting beans, that's worth doing, is wrong. And the fact that this is really the first time that the bean price has not dipped significantly, but instead has slowly bled out over the past couple of weeks or months, from our perspective, is a major indication that the quality of the model is continuing to improve dramatically. And therefore, it really does feel like this is maybe not right now, but the next couple months will be a really key point in the evolution of Beanstalk as a system, and whether or not the DAO can realign itself with the work that needs to get done, such that the protocol is able to outcompete all of its competitors in the grand scheme of things. So it's very unfortunate what's going on, in our opinion.
One thing maybe to also, worth mentioning are the contributors at Beanstalk Farms have time and time again, rose to the occasion, and did the work and stood by, even when there was no guarantee, or there is no guarantee, and on the the reward, let's say, or the payback for it. Keeping in mind that none of the contributors at Beanstalk get any source of things such as stock grants or equity or anything of that sort. It's just pure beans. That if we want to compare the other opportunity that's available to the same set contributors elsewhere, it's a no-brainer. And maybe there's a part of it that comes to think of it that take these things for granted, but maybe, yeah.
I want to respond to a couple questions that were made, or comments that were made in the chat. Disco Stu asks, so is there or is there not a threat to effective governance by diminishing participation? Definitely there is, but would again say that that's a tech problem, that Beanstalk needs an implementation of governance that facilitates the alignment between the development of the protocol and the security of the protocol. And again, that seems to be the biggest limiting factor in the tech at the moment. But if we zoom out, there's a lot of other tech that will need to get built in order to facilitate real economic activity. And Warthog says, you guys are in a bubble. Don't know exactly who that's addressed to, but would assume it might be addressed to us, and would ask you to be candid about where you think we're missing the mark and to elaborate on it. Because if there's something that we are missing or anyone is missing, I think it's on all of us collectively to raise our voices and make it clear what it is that we feel is important that is not being addressed sufficiently. And that is different than disagreeing on solutions, but really want to push back on ad hominem stuff like that. And then Warthog says, explain what you are building, communicate roadmap and cool tech and future state plans and announcements, not just on DAO recordings. To some extent, that's fair, but there's only so much time that can be spent talking. There has to be time spent doing. And we spent, just on my end, I probably spent 100 or 200 hours writing those two pieces, independent of contribution from the other Publius. And that comes at the margin of a lot of other stuff. And so would push back heavily and say that, if we spend all of our time just writing our thoughts down, nothing will ever get built. And then you're just a talker. And we don't think we're talkers. So would encourage everyone to be a little bit more honest with themselves about whether they are informed, and if they're not informed, why they're not informed. But the idea that there isn't the information out there for people to inform themselves in a relatively timely fashion between the recordings of the DAO meetings or the weekly updates that talk about the updates, that are written versions of the updates. A more reasonable piece of feedback would be that the updates aren't substantive enough and they need to be longer. That may be, and things can be improved at the margin. But the idea of the statement, explain what you were building, to me is very disingenuous in the sense that there's no amount of additional communication that we can imagine being worthwhile at the margin. And we do want to just push back on our own point and say that if people do feel that way, that is important for us to know. And if people feel like they don't know what's going on, please make it known that the resources that are available are not the resources that people need, and suggest other resources that you will find helpful. And I'm betting that those resources will soon exist if people request them. So there's a lot that can be done to get the answers that people want and get the explanations that people want. But the concept of things need to be explained does seem disingenuous because of the many different forms that things are being explained. But what would potentially be a much more constructive and helpful criticism would be saying what additional or different forms of content can be created on a regular or non-regular interval such that people do have a sense of what's going on. And separately, do want to just say that the blog posts didn't mention Beanstalk basically at all. And I guess you could make an argument that the second piece, which is more about Beanstalk development update, that it is related to Beanstalk. By the same token, it's like none of those updates were about the changes to Beanstalk, the protocol itself, and more about developments that can potentially create or facilitate real economic activity that uses Beans and Beanstalk. So really do want to just make it clear that we are trying our absolute best as Publius. We talk extensively with members of Beanstalk Farms about how best to communicate everything that's going on. And if that feels like the limiting factor, that people don't know what's going on, please offer suggestions on how to do that. But the idea that this isn't being communicated or explained feels very disingenuous.
And just to keep things maybe lighthearted, Asabinia suggests that Beethoven can make a song that explains the updates. Okay, we're almost top of the hour, but I see folks still typing, so we can wait a bit and continue this conversation even if it goes beyond the hour.
So Disco Sue says participation is really a tech issue, usually a marketing issue. I disagree that governance is a tech issue. I think it's risky to double down on the tech as the problem and solution. This is like the proverbial hammer only seeing nails. The team is working really hard, but perhaps some of that effort is being misallocated. Perhaps I could better explain what we mean by that in the sense that the protocol needs to have a system of governance in place such that governance cannot be the thing that destroys the protocol. At the moment, if the DAO is unable to make any changes to the protocol in perpetuity or unwilling to, the protocol is unlikely to succeed as the issuer of money. And so the tech issue as we see it is the ability for the protocol to implement a system of governance such that that problem is removed. Don't think that is particularly related to participation in governance. Perhaps the tech problem is how the system should respond to a lack of participation, if that makes sense. Mixo Lydian says, do you think it's fair to say that current DeFi has essentially failed when we now have censorship-free ways to own value, exchange it, and earn yields that are in some cases better than fiat alternatives? As in criticizing the current primitives, to me, also misuses the fact that a lot of value has been brought to the space, even if it seems trivial at times. From our perspective, probably the only, if we limit it to DeFi and we put money aside, where Bitcoin and Ether are potentially better forms of money than current money, although we would disagree with that statement, but it's possible that it's correct. When you think about DeFi, we would, going back to the blog post, we would identify DeFi or finance as trading and loans primarily, and don't feel like the ability to trade in a censorship-resistant fashion is in any way, shape, or form competitive with centralized alternatives, with the potential exception of GMX. And even there, it's like, that's probably closer to a loan. And from that perspective, really the only thing that is cool in DeFi from a comparison to centralized tech is trustless borrowing, where you can mint liquidity or mint LUSD or mint DAI or take bets on GMX without a counterparty. That is really cool, but that's not even close to enough to facilitate any sort of real economic activity. It's almost like the ability to take on leverage is putting the it's like a chicken and egg problem, where you need some sort of real economic activity and you need the ability to borrow in order to facilitate that economic activity, but there still isn't the ability to really have economic activity on chain. So definitely don't think it's unfair to say that current DeFi has essentially failed. In fact, that was the purpose of the articles that we wrote, which is to say that current DeFi really sucked. So J-Dub says, not questioning what is being built, just saying selling is vital. I mean, candidly, if there was no question of legality and securities laws, I think it would be much more easy to say, yeah, let's figure out how we collectively can go sell this to the world. But think that that's probably not a great solution given the current regulatory environment. And so there is a little bit of a difficulty here in terms of how can we honestly, as a community, how can we honestly communicate ourselves and what's going on to the world at large without selling. In fact, feel like the word selling is really a problem. And maybe the thing that needs to happen is more education and more awareness. And these things come in waves, and at the moment there doesn't seem to be much interest in learning about Beanstalk. So maybe the thing that can be done is a stronger educational effort, more content to get out there for people to see and to learn about. But those blog posts that we published are along those lines and in line with that idea for how to best get Beanstalk on people's radars. But it's hard to see more along the lines of selling being a good idea at this point.
Publius, do you not think that it's okay to have periods of downtime? I don't know. We're talking about like what, a few months, maybe 2 months. Like Bitcoin had years. Is it not okay to have these prolonged periods of low activity or no activity before things go on? Is it unrealistic to expect high activity every month or every week, or I don't know what the period is?
This is the whole concept of Beanstalk, which is, can it exist in any and all market conditions? That's it. Chilling at 95, 94 cents in the middle of this bear market is, and not just the way it's chilling, it's slowly decreasing, and there's no demand for beans whatsoever at the moment. And nonetheless, the protocol remains relatively in good shape. And again, you you put it in the context of the seeds per BDV sticks out as a major issue in terms of peg maintenance that could be fixed in a simple way very quickly if the goal was to repeg immediately. But instead, again, from our perspective, the goal continues to be to implement things once and then iterate on that further, as opposed to implementing short-term solutions. So if the peg were the problem, we would be in favor of changing the seeds per BDV to some extent, but we don't see it as a problem, and in fact see this as another data point that the model is actually doing quite well. And over time, particularly if we fast forward and assume that the system is back at peg and back growing again, these types of data points, these different types of crashes, if you will, where sometimes it's a fast crash as Beanstalk has experienced, sometimes it's a slow bleed. All of these are good data points for the model and should, in the grand scheme of things, create more confidence that the protocol is sustainable from an economics perspective, and really just don't think it makes sense to get lost in the weeds of the price is off by 5 cents. It's like, what's the inflation rate in the US right now? The peg maintenance is an imperfect science, and Beanstalk really does seem to be at the forefront. So yeah, let's not hold Beanstalk to a perfect standard and instead hold it to a standard relative to everything else that's going on. And in that context, things are definitely still moving in the right direction. And you consider the amount of beans that have been minted relative to the bean supply and relative to liquidity in the past, and the liquidity to supply ratio at those times, the system continues to be in a dramatically healthier position than it's ever been in before. So it is important to just contextualize what's going on and not get lost in the sauce. Albion asks, if there's concern about Beanstalk's legal or regulatory status, wouldn't it be better to find out now? Why is it more desirable to march on, grow quietly, and then find out the answer to these questions later? Would bifurcate Beanstalk and Beanstalk Farms in this case, and say that Beanstalk is a permissionless open source protocol, and we went through what we believe to be the most honest and fair and transparent process to create the system as possible, and think that is really fundamentally different, given that it's a software that runs on Ethereum, to Beanstalk Farms, which is people and people that are working on Beanstalk. And as soon as you have people start to sell beans, that's a very different thing than building Beanstalk. And the other comment is, wouldn't it be better to find out now? The government is in particular not giving any answers. There is no way to get clarity. So aside from going to the SEC and asking for them to approve it, which they never do, I think Polkadot might be one of the only cases where they did approve anything. But that might have even been through I think it was through the SEC. The concept is that this is not something where the regulatory environment is conducive towards compliance, because compliance is totally undefined. And frankly, don't think that it's likely that from a regulatory perspective, Beanstalk remains in the clear, particularly if it's successful. It seems likely that the government will come after either us, Publius, or Beanstalk Farms at some point. Who knows? But as soon as there's a shift towards selling beans, and the goal is, hey, this person is supposed to sell beans, yeah, that's very clearly, at least from our perspective, a data point that is unlikely to help Beanstalk in the regulatory environment. So yeah, we would love nothing more than to be able to talk freely about how, great Beanstalk is, if you will. But that's just not the world we live in.
Okay, we are at the end of the Barnyard chat. I still see folks typing, so maybe we give it a minute or two. before we conclude this meeting.
Mixo Lydian asks, are you currently happy, Publius, with the way things are going? Think everything needs to be evaluated at the margin. Think that some things are imperfect. The fact that the Seraph BIP didn't pass is probably not great. But think that from a high level, we don't think that there's any group or project that is doing anything that would indicate to us that Beanstalk is not still the future. And we are very excited to continue to work on this and are really encouraged by the quality of development, the quality of the people that continue to be attracted and work on Beanstalk, and the rate of improvement on both of those fronts. And therefore, this feels like a bump in the road, but generally, this is a true bear market, and beans are at 95 cents. That's pretty good. That is pretty good from our perspective. So things can always be better. There could be a pump in APY right now, and the market cap could be at 1 billion beans, but that's not reality, and therefore, putting things in the context of the market at large and the fact that the exploit happened less than a year ago, we don't feel like we have much to complain about at the moment.
C-Mill says that he kind of wants the call or the meeting to continue. We can continue as much and as long as farmers want to. J-Dubs asks if there has been a discussion on extending the budget bit or the budget from being a quarterly budget to a 6 months budget. This has been discussed and it's taken into consideration.
So when Beanstalk Farms was originally created, the thought was that in order to give the DAO the most control over what was being done, it made sense to have shorter renewals. But if the funding continues to be such a friction point, one solution is to just get funding approved for longer periods of time. But I feel like there's probably a better solution where the DAO can continue to have frequent say on what is being funded and how it's being funded, and still do it in a way where there perhaps isn't as much friction every time there needs to be something funded. But do want to just say, we don't think that the model, at least at this point, don't feel like the model of the DAO minting beans to fund new shit, that's something that should exist forever. But given that the stage that Beanstalk is at right now, it probably does continue to make sense.
Okay, I see J-Dubs typing, so we'll wait for that message. All right, and J-Dubs, I think, was saying that they are probably leaning more towards the 6 months instead of 3 months. Okay, with that, we're at the end of this of the Barnyard chat or this meeting. Again, to everyone, we can continue this conversation at any channel on Discord. We can have impromptu, meetings if needed, and otherwise, we'll be having this meeting every week. So we'll see you next week. Thank you all for joining.